on nuclear necropolitics titled Radioactive Ghosts. And it deals mainly with the, and in a very large sense, with the legacy of Hiroshima. I deal with nuclear war, nuclear politics, but also nuclear energy politics. This particular talk today opens with reflections on one of the most widely disseminated icons in the collective memory of Hiroshima. The ghostly imprint of a human body on stone. And there are many, many images that you can pull up on your computers, but this is one of them where you can see the human shadow imprinted on stone. These images have been commemorated in many poems, and I open with an epigraph drawn from Denis Levertov's poem Gathered at the River. And please make sure you signal if I'm not loud enough. I want you all to hear me in the back. The words are spoken of those who survived for a while, living shadowgraphs, eyes fixed forever on witnessed horror. Denis Levertov's use of the trope living shadowgraphs refers to the ghostly imprints of a human body left after the nuclear attack on the stone steps leading to the Sumitomo Bank in Hiroshima. These shadowgraphs are the enduring remainders of a human incinerated on the stone steps by the flash of atomic heat rays of temperatures well over 1,000 and possibly 2,000 degrees centigrade. The image of this ghostly human shadow left by thermal rays on stone has haunted me ever since I first saw it in high school. It was the images of Night and Fog, Alain Bonet's documentary about the concentration camps, and this shadow image of an incinerated human that embodied for me the twin horrors of World War II, the camps and the atomic bomb. As the continuing history of its reception in the cultural imaginary demonstrates, the Hiroshima Shadow image is haunting in its very iconic value. It is haunting because this trace of a human, incinerated and burned into stone, turns viewers into witnesses of a trauma that extends from the past into the distant future. Burning, another world enters through the shadows of bodies flashed on walls, writes Native American writer Linda Hogan. Evoked by the past trauma of an individual life that was annihilated by the first atomic bomb, this other world mobilizes the knowledge of a possible future annihilation, a world of bodies flashed on walls that heralds extinction of life. The latter causes a permanent trauma that is a hitherto unknown anticipatory haunting from the future. In fact, I argue that this material trace condenses a memory of the past with what we could call, with a nod to Marilyn Strathern, a memory of the future. We cannot resist imagining this man's life as it was snatched away from him in a second, consumed by a murderous nuclear force whose radiation left nothing but his shadow image, a stain on the stair, a mnemonic icon of atomic death. Decades after I saw the Hiroshima Shadow graph, I was reminded again of its power when I read Arundhati Roy's War Talk, her manifesto against nuclear madness and global wars. Composed of a sequence of speeches, this short book has itself a haunting force. Roy describes how, during the nuclear standoff between India and Pakistan, the Hiroshima Shadow image comes back to her. And I quote from Roy: "My friends and I discussed Prophecy, the documentary about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the fireball, the dead bodies choking the river, the living stripped of skin and hair, the thick black toxic water, the scorched burning air, the cancers implanted genetically, a malignant letter to the unborn. We remember especially the man who just melted into the steps of a building. We imagine ourselves like that, as stains on staircases. I imagine future generations of hushed school children pointing at my stain. This was a writer, not she or he, this." In her personalization of the shadows haunting from the future, Roy imagines her own annihilation, including the way future generations will see her as a depersonalized trace, a stain on the staircase. This powerful projection invites readers to acknowledge that one day they might disappear like this, their traces left as stains on a stone. Over the past 70 years, the Hiroshima Shadow image has become the foremost allegory of the first weapon with the power to extinguish planetary life. It thus embodies a haunting from the anticipated future of our own species' suicide, a suicide that is also a mnemocide, since there will be no witness left to carry the memory. We are haunted by the question whether the last remaining humans, animals and plants on Earth will be incinerated in an all-out nuclear war, leaving nothing behind but their shadows engraved on stone. The shadowgraphs thus serves as a memento mori of an entirely new kind, not one that recalls mortality and the impermanence of life, but one that memorializes the work of death and annihilation humans have created as a haunting possibility. Anticipating our own extinction as a species, along with that of fellow species, it mirrors our self-destructive necropower, driven by an embrace of death over life. This haunting fantasy, not to say phantasm, of shadow images left by the last living beings on the stones of ruins of a dead planet reaches beyond Derrida's fantasy of a remainderless destruction of the human archive in an all-out nuclear war. And I'm referring here to Derrida's article, No Apocalypse, Not Now, that appeared, I think, in 1984 in a special issue from Critical Inquiry titled Nuclear Criticism. And it was, in a way, the first instance in which critical theorists addressed the issue of the challenge of the atomic bomb on critical theory and of the challenge of Hiroshima, but also the challenge of a possible future nuclear war. Because the stones and ruins of our civilization might retain a ghostly remainder that is a nuclear shadow archive of our lives, albeit without anyone left to remember. Will we be literally buried in an archive, the shadows of our bodies inscribed on stone tablets like the original 10 Commandments? Will we be entirely and forever forgotten, or will an alien civilization arrive on Earth in time before the erosion of stone has erased our shadows? Will they read our remaining traces like hieroglyphs of an alien language? And is this apocalyptic vision, this paradox of an archive without mnemonic power, the only consoling fantasy once we imagine planetary extinction in a nuclear war? In a way, I rephrase here questions that have been asked by many, not only critical theorists, but creative writers, including science fiction writers. Shadows have not been given ontological status in Western metaphysics, Alfonso Lingus asserts. Quote from Lingus: "We do not have concepts for all their motley forms. They are not a text. They exist in the free spaces of the world of weighty things. They are glories and menaces that emanate from things." The Hiroshima shadowgraphs have generated such profound responses in the cultural imaginary precisely because they have opened a paradoxical, transitional space between survival and extinction. For the immediate survivors of Hiroshima, they are the shadow of extinction of a human that foreshadows a final extinction, and mnemocide that encompasses the entire human history. For others worldwide who come across the image, the menacing shadows of irradiated humans also assumes an archival quality. Remainders of catastrophic light, or as Akira Lippitt calls it, atomic light. The Hiroshima shadowgraphs merge the weightlessness of shadows with the material weight of stone. The strong, often poetic reactions to their material archive are testimony to a transference in which the depicted shadow humans assume the quality of dream images. Paradoxically, the human buried in this archive comes alive as a phantasm, returning to viewers as a living dead, a radioactive ghost. Exhibiting the bodily trace of a human killed by the heat and light of an exploding nuclear weapon, the shadow figure on the steps in Hiroshima, now in the Hiroshima Historical Peace Museum, that constitutes a material archive, thus constitutes a material archive of destruction. Formed by a force that preserves a visible trace of the bomb's annihilating flash, what remains is a spectral shadow archive of atomic writing. It invokes a collective memory, a traumatic destruction concealed in its material trace. It is this implicit allusion to a phantom world of total destruction that has generated the image's intense transference. As Libet reminds us, the first use of the atomic bomb inaugurated the age of invisible warfare. That is, a warfare that extends beyond the immediate damage into the distant future. While the Hiroshima bomb unleashed the most spectacular violence in the history of warfare, the atomic waves of invisible radiation in survivors' bodies continue the warfare indefinitely and out of sight, so to speak. Beyond its immediate annihilating destruction, the atomic work of death continues to operate as a form of slow violence inside the bodies of victims, thus extending into the aftermath of the official end of the war. While many of the immediate victims suffer and die from radiation sickness and later from cancers, this invisible warfare also operates transgenerationally, potentially inflicting genetic damage on subsequent generations of children of victims and their children. While previous wars had left a cyclic transgenerational legacy of war trauma, this invisible warfare is the first that leaves a transgenerational physical legacy of genetic damage. This is a kind of, the concept I'm developing here is the concept of a material memory. It's a kind of material physical memory encoded in the DNA. Harboring an invisible enemy inside their bodies, victims are prone to experience a pervasive haunting from the future. The body's material molecular memory becomes the carrier of ongoing, slow, invisible violence. Generated by the violence of splitting the atom, the radiance of 1,000 suns, Oppenheimer's quote, functions as an icon that further illustrates the relationship of light and warfare. Paul Virilio describes the effect of nuclear warfare as the inauguration of the age of light weapons. Quote by Virilio, "The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were light weapons that prefigured the enhanced radiation neutron bomb, the direct beam laser weapons, and the charged particle guns." Virilio then traces the imprints left by atomic rays on walls and human bodies. Virilio quote again, "The first bomb produced a nuclear flash which lasted 1/15 millionth of a second and whose brightness penetrated every building down to the cellars. It left its imprints on stone walls, changing their apparent color through the fusion of certain minerals. The same was the case with clothing and bodies, where kimono patterns were tattooed on the victim's flesh. It took Hiroshima and Nagasaki to expose the destructive effects of invisible radiation and generate a first wave of public awareness. Expanding on Virilio, Libet describes the effects of their resemblance to photographic negatives. Nothing remains except the radiation. At Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two views of invisibility, absolute visibility and total transparency, unfolded under the brilliant force of the atomic blasts. instantly penetrated by massive force of radiation. The hibakusha, the name for the survivors, were seared into the environment with the photographic certainty of having been there. In the aftermath of the bombings, the remaining bodies absorbed and were absorbed by the invisible radiation. These bodies vanished slowly until there was nothing left but their negatives. In nuclear memory politics, these negatives of bodies vanishing into their lonely inscriptions on walls create the first archive of nuclear destruction. Its paradoxical temporality extends into a future when the living species on this planet might have vanished into mere traces on walls and other solid objects. If this archive of the future is material rather than remainderless, as Derrida imagined it to be, the accompanying mnemosite also renders it an obsolete archive, one deprived of its very archival function. Paradoxically, the posthumous existence of such an archive can, as Derrida asserted, only be grasped as a rhetorical condition, envisioned in an anticipatory, imaginary mode as an effect of species suicide that includes the ultimate destruction of human memory. And in a certain sense, I argue that precisely because it can only be imagined as in a rhetorical condition, that it has generated, it has literally fueled the human imagination and generated an immense flood of literature, fiction, but also science fiction and poetry. While the Hiroshima Shadow figure offers concrete material evidence of atomic destruction, exemplary of the only traces that may remain after an all-out nuclear war, we need fiction or poetry to tell a fuller story of this haunting from a future that outlives us in the form of an archive of our collective nuclear memories with no one to remember. I moved to a new section that is called Scale and the Boundaries of Imagination. The first section, by the way, was called Atomic Trace. 5 years after Hiroshima, Ray Bradbury published his short story, August 2016. We luckily survived that one. There Will Come Soft Rains. Set in the aftermath of nuclear war, it is a story without humans. All that remains is a house that stands alone in a city of rubble and ashes, enveloped in radioactive glow. On the black west face of the house, there is another shadow archive of destruction. I quote Bradbury from Bradbury. The silhouette in paint of a man mowing a lawn. Here, as in a photograph, a woman bent to pick flowers. Still farther over, their images burned on wood. In one titanic instant, a small boy, hands flung into the air, higher up, the image of a thrown ball, and opposite of him a girl, hands raised to catch a ball which never came down. A still life of total annihilation, the scene depicts a world in which time and memory are frozen into an image of life halted in a flash, its only witness, the imaginary narrator who must have come upon this archive of destruction from elsewhere, because otherwise she would not have lived to see. Is she a returnee, a stranger, an alien, a mere abstraction? Embodying a memory of the future, she also holds on to a politics of slow witnessing that reaches beyond the spectacular images of actual nuclear catastrophe. Reminiscent of the scenes of everyday life in Roman civilization left in the excavated city of Pompeii after its destruction by the devastating volcanic eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79 AD, Bradbury's scene depicts life in permanent standstill. Yet, while the bodies of the citizens of Pompeii become spectral sculptures, remaining intact in density, form, and shape, and retaining clarity, figuration, and materiality, the still life of the victims of nuclear destruction become two-dimensional, photographic, spectral images. There's a troubling ambiguity inherent in these spectral remainders of life. While we may read them as testimonies of death and destruction, they also bear witness to the tenacity of life and its traces in stone. These remainders or traces thus evoke a paradoxical coincidence of impermanence and persistence, precariousness and tenacity. In fact, they challenge us to think of memory in a more expansive way, including material mnemonic traces of extinct life. From this encompassing perspective, it almost seems as if we can envision the material archive as a last form of resistance to mnemocide. Collective memory would then linger and persist in material atomic traces, potentially outliving the life of bodies and organisms. These traces compel us to consider the extension of memory beyond actual witnessing and survival. In After Finitude, Quentin Meillassoux develops a concept of ancestrality, or the arche-fossil, that is, of the manifestation of the world anterior to any human form. According to Meillassoux, the problem of the arche-fossil, quote, concerns every discourse whose meaning includes a temporal discrepancy between thinking and being. Thus, not only statements about events occurring prior to the emergence of humans, but also statements about possible events that are ulterior to the extinction of the human species. Meillassoux, in other words, raises the question of how we can think and speak about times beyond the lifetime of the human species and their archival memories. While this before and after the human is accessible to scientific speculation, it transcends the boundaries of human experience and imagination. Since this problem of memory, temporality, and scale imposes itself on any form of imagining, let alone commemorating our own extinction, we may say that it is constitutive of the nuclear age. The threat of nuclear extinction, however, pushes the arche-fossil's challenge to human imagination beyond the mathematization of nature that Meyasu focuses on. If one wishes to grasp the philosophical and ethical implications of thinking pre- and post-human temporalities, the challenge of ancestrality or the archaefossil cannot be reduced to a scientific problem. Imagining ancestrality, I argue, needs to include the politics of emotion and affect and the necessary rearrangement of desire required to expand imagination beyond the terrestrial relation to the world. Thinking along the trajectory of the archaefossil also bears upon the question of the archive and its quasi-symbiotic relationship to memory and witnessing. Meyasu addresses the, quote, sense of desolation and abandonment which modern science instills in humanity's conception of itself and of the cosmos. A desolation tied to the knowledge of thought's contingency for the world, a world that is essentially unaffected by whether or not anyone thinks it. For Meyasu, the challenge of ancestrality generates a crisis in belonging. While humans may know that they belong to the infinity of the cosmological order, their belonging is not meaningful in any metaphysical sense, according to Meyasu. On the contrary, it is suddenly seen as utterly contingent. The world does not care about the human species or human thought, hence the sense of desolation and abandonment. Meyasu, however, does not ask why and how do we as humans care about our belonging, and why do we feel a responsibility when human-induced forces propel extinction? Why do we feel compelled to create paradoxical memories of the future of extinction? And here I should make an aside saying that much of what I say here about nuclear politics and possible nuclear extinction is of course also true about climate change and more generally about what we have come to call the Anthropocene. And one reason why I did the book Radioactive Ghosts is actually to emphasize that I think we need to think climate change and nuclear politics together. The debates run kind of parallel with practically the debates about the Anthropocene having taken over, and nuclear politics is for many complicated political reasons eclipsed or considered almost a thing of the past. After '89, people talked about it as if the nuclear threat is over. All it took was Donald Trump to enter the scene, of course, and this changed again. But I think we need also theoretical and conceptual tools to think the two debates together and bring them into conversation. What is the political ethics involved in the creation of such fantasies and phantasms of extinction? These questions, I think, need to be at the center of theorizing the human species and their political responsibility today. Significantly, Meyasu links both science's insistence on thought's contingency and the human sense of desolation and abandonment to the nuclear. And here, the last Meyasu quote, science's diachronic statements assume that the question of the witness has become irrelevant to knowledge of the event. In other words, the decay of the radioactive material or the nature of the stellar emission are described in such a way that they must be assumed to be adequate to what we manage to think about them, while the question as to whether or not they were witnessed becomes irrelevant to the adequacy of this description. Or again, both this decay and this emission are conceived in such a way that they would have been identical to what we think about them, even if human thought had never existed to think them. And this is probably something we can discuss, because he's making a very strong ontological argument here. Meyasu, however, ignores the fact that without human thought, a potential annihilation of life by nuclear war would not exist. He also fails to address that the very knowledge of a possible human-induced extinction inevitably tinges the sense of desolation and abandonment with a sense of mortifying guilt. Hopefully, I know that not everybody feels this guilt, but conceptually. This is what generates a haunting from the future of an archive without witness. And it is this very haunting that pushes the human imagination beyond the boundaries of what Meyasu calls the terrestrial relation to the world. Perhaps this is why human imagination has become so enmeshed, if not obsessed, with a new kind of archive fever in which visions of an archive without a witness have assumed iconic, if not allegorical value. Jorge Luis Borges' Library of Babel, for example, presents a paradigmatic example of such a spectral archive in a world without humans. A Borges quote, I suspect that the human species, the unique species, is about to be extinguished. But the library will endure, illuminated, solitary, infinite, perfectly motionless, useless, incorruptible, secret. These spectral shadow archives of witnessless memories, we might say, will forever seal the culture of secrecy and deception at the heart of nuclear necropolitics. Solitary, motionless, useless, incorruptible, and secret into eternity. And into eternity, I make a nod to Michael Madsen's film about the impossibility of storing nuclear waste. The film is titled Into Eternity. We can, however, also imagine possible non-human witnesses after the extinction of the human species. How would they encounter the remainders of our lives and cultures, objects and artifacts, buildings and burial sites, our bones and teeth? This is the question posed by the work of Argentinian artist Adrián Villarrojas, one of the most challenging visionaries of deep history, and we could add deep memory. In Today We Reboot the Planet, he places his viewers in the position of an alien, observing the remainders of the human world long after its demise. Like Borges in the Aleph, Villarrojas envisions a holonomic space that contains everything that has ever existed or even been imagined. It is a space suggestive of a scale beyond human time, a deep history and a geological time that includes prehistoric millennia as well as future ones that emerge beyond the lifetime of the human species on Earth. Allegorically depicting the entirety of human worlds in fossilized ancient ruins or fragile clay replicas of humans and their object world, Via Rojas challenges his viewers to think and imagine a space beyond memory, a scale larger than human, larger even than the planetary life of species. The mood of this world is mournful, replete with reminders of humans' guilt, of their complicity in their own extinction, their footprint in the Anthropocene. Via Rojas' fossilized worlds with their fragile clay replicas thus generate a memory of the future through an artificial archive of the anticipated extinction of the human world. Can we, despite their mournful silences, relate to Via Rojas' work as consoling objects? Do we perhaps hope or fear that one day in the distant future, as Beryl Williams suggests in her poem Strategies for Survival, the post-nuclear children will find our spectral shadow archives with our fossilized bones? And here's a quote from Williams' poem. Better, we say, in the dark and only when our own children sleep, to leave no trace that might entice that one slightly curious, star-eyed drifter. Better we whisper and dream separately, secretly, of arrows on rocks, scripts in caves. Williams' poem expresses a deep ambivalence about atomic destruction, the trace, and memory. Do we want to leave our memory traces to post-nuclear children? Will there even be post-nuclear children, or will nuclear annihilation indeed be, as Derrida envisions, remainderless? And how do we deal with imagining, depicting, and ethically reacting to such a legacy of the nuclear age? And now I have a very short final section, which is called Hyper-Objects and Animacies. And Animacies refers to Mel Chen's book of the same title, and I explain more what it is. Inspired by Into Eternity, Michael Madsen's documentary about the deep time of nuclear waste, Timothy Morton in Hyper-Objects claims that humans are becoming, in Heideggerian terms, guardians of futurality. Morton links this notion with the nuclear guardianship movement co-founded by Buddhist scholar and systems analyst Joanna Macy. Designed to deal with the safe storage of nuclear waste, the Rocky Flats Nuclear Guardianship is a trans-generational project that aims at securing a citizen commitment to present and future generations to keep radioactive materials out of the biosphere. Intrigued by the nuclear guardianship's suggestion to encase plutonium in gold, which can absorb gamma rays, Morton states, quote, nuclear guardianship seeks nuclear materials as a unit, a hyper-object. Hyper-objects such as, for example, radioactive materials or climate affect, according to Morton, core ideas of what it means to exist, what Earth is, what society is. They also force humans to acknowledge that, as Morton says, nuclear materials are occupying social space. We might add that the challenge to think across unimaginable scales and spans of time also affects the boundaries of subjectivity and intersubjectivity, as well as the appropriate modes of memory and communication. In The Great Derailment, Amitav Ghosh makes a case for extending the boundaries of communication toward the figural and the iconic. Ghosh's thoughts on the shadow of language and the urgency of remobilizing the ability to think in images bear a certain resonance with the visionary reflections of André Leroi-Gourhan on figurative speech, on figurative representation in his book Gesture and Speech. First published in French in 1964, this monumental work on the history of human communication maintains an astounding actuality in light of today's debates about nuclear and environmental politics in the Anthropocene. Figurative representation, Leroi-Gourhan writes, is the language of visible forms. Like the language of words, it holds humanity by the root, and the human solution has to be based on the construction of historical trajectories that support the creative urge in the long ascent, followed by a fall and by other new trajectories. The search for the figurative is therefore written into the future of mankind. Unparalleled in his attunement to thinking across scale, Leroi-Gourhan thinks in terms of gigantic waves of communicative leaps with long ascents and falls throughout the history of humans, dating all the way back to the early humanoids. In the final chapter of Gesture and Speech, Imaginary Freedom and the Fate of Homo sapiens, Leroi-Gourhan asks where Homo sapiens as a thinking animal is going. Interestingly, he traces the great derangement, so to speak, back to the time when, with the formation of large cities, the relationship between the psychic and the physical has lost its balance. That this lack of equilibrium culminates, according to Leroi-Gourhan, in such vast diverse phenomena as today's increasing dominance of electronic media, dispersed forms of traditional warfare, the atomic bomb, and environmental crises. Speculating about the future of Homo sapiens, Leroi-Gourhan wonders if one of the silent controllers of atomic launching towers will perhaps one day pull the handle which will automatically release the bomb at the precise starting point of a trajectory selected by an electronic computer. Yet even the necessity to think like Leroi-Gourhan across deep time, distant futures and unfathomable scales does not seem to be enough. We also need to learn to think at smaller scales, including the minute scale of the atom. If we were to consider nuclear materials with Morton as unique beings, we need simultaneously to think at a scale of millennia and at the small scale of what we could call, with Deleuze and Guattari, the molecular. Interestingly, Morton's sense of nuclear materials as unique beings bears certain resonances with Nelchen's concept of animacies and her related thoughts on molecularity. Originating in linguistics, where the term animacy generally refers to the grammatical effects of the sentience of liveliness of nouns, Chen expands the concepts of animacy, drawing on queer of color scholarship, critical animal studies, biopolitics, disability theory, and critical theory more generally, with the goal of using animacy as a supplement to concepts such as life or liveliness. In performing such diverse tasks as rewriting conditions of intimacy, engendering different communalisms, and revisiting biopolitical spheres, the concept helps Chen, quote, to theorize current anxieties about the production of humanness in contemporary times. In the politics of life itself, Niklas Rose argues that contemporary biopolitics must now be considered molecular. Quote, it is now at the molecular level that human life is understood, at the molecular level that its processes can be anatomized, and at the molecular level that life can now be engineered. In the move from biopolitics to necropolitics, this engineering of life at the molecular level performs the slow violence of a work of toxic death. That's Melchin's quote. In Deleuze and Guattari's terms, we could speak of a nuclear micropolitics that operates at the molecular level of the body. Nuclear necropolitics demands both a macropolitics that extends the imagination to span millions of years, and a micropolitics that accounts for the transgenerational effects of the engineering of life at the molecular level. Nuclear and other environmental catastrophes thus challenge the boundaries of thought, emotion, language, and memory. At the molecular microscopic level, nuclear forces also challenge the boundaries of life itself. The fact that we deal simultaneously with a monumental hyperobject and with molecular animacies allows us to understand why it is so hard to grasp the terrifying scope and scale of nuclear necropolitics, let alone to tell its stories. But this very predicament also compels us to understand why we can't stop doing so. It's all of us, writes Arundhati Roy. That's what nuclear bombs do. Whether they are used or not, they violate everything that is humane. They alter the meaning of life itself. And I'll end here. Thank you for